How's everyone doing? Today we're ranking the 16 personality types based on just how depressed they are. So let's get into it. We have kind of a definition here. It says, of a person in a state of general unhappiness or despondency. You guys know what depressed means if you're watching this channel. Certain lines are underlined because, well, I copy and pasted it from Google. So it just is what it is. As you can see, I'm a little bit dark here. It's a little bit dark. I'm surviving the cold Canadian winter. So I'm the most depressed truly on this list. That's why I'm shrouded in darkness. So let's get into it. So first we have INFJs. Just how depressed truly are INFJs? Let me see here. I'm gonna say for INFJs in general, they do kind of fit. They do kind of fit high, and here's the reasons why. So INFJs, they have introverted feeling pretty low. That FI critic function is very pessimistic. They're very self-critical. They're hard on themselves. They're not going to feel a lot of positive emotion. So that's just a general attribute of someone who's depressed. They also have introverted sensing in their very last slot. Introverted sensing can also be kind of a sign, a quote, of despondency, of depression, depending how you want to define it, of course. Now, all of these types, of course, as a general precursor before I get too many negative comments, are going to experience depression for lots of reasons. And in a general sense, depression can just be due to not living a fulfilling life, not necessarily getting required socialization, exercise, fulfillment, different things. So any personality type can be depressed or not. But in general, certain personality types can sometimes have a disproportionate level of sadness, of feelings, of despondency, unhappiness, stress, all of these things. And in general, INFJs can definitely be up on that list because of that introverted feeling, introverted sensing loop of, I am feeling bad with FI critic. I don't feel good about myself, mixed with introverted sensing demon, which just generally doesn't feel satisfied. It doesn't feel comfortable. It's just always uncomfortable. It's always kind of doubting itself. It's insecure. It's always kind of hard on itself. And because of that, INFJs can experience a high level of depression for those reasons when they're looping those functions, when they're not able to necessarily engage with the external world and absorb those kind of positive feelings from their external environment, those positive feelings from others. If they end up isolating, which can be very easy for an INFJ to do, and they end up in that loneliness, that's when it's really going to come out. The loneliness of low SI mixed with the kind of critical, negative, low self-esteem of introverted feeling, kind of just a general feeling of badness, a feeling of being unhappy. That can often occur unless they're pushing themselves with those extroverted functions. We have ENFJs, and in many ways, ENFJs are similar. ENFJs have pessimistic introverted feeling, pessimistic introverted sensing. They spend all of their time alone. They're going to get into a little bit of an emotional rut as well. That being said, ENFJs are definitely much better at putting themselves out there. ENFJs are much better at being able to get out there, connect with people, socialize, and because of that, it helps them from being depressed as much. That being said, it really depends on an ENFJ. If an ENFJ isolates and is away from people, or if they feel rejected by other people, or if they feel like they're unwanted, or they're undervalued, or they're underappreciated, those things are going to build up. And because of that, I would still say there can be an above average potential with that pessimistic FI being kind of feeling unworthy, not good enough, that potential for isolation. Being an intuitive can always make you feel a little bit more unusual or different from the sensor world. And because of that, I would say ENFJs can have depressive ruts that they get into, especially if they're younger or a little bit less social side of their mind, a little more introverted side of their mind, or just their circumstances. They can definitely feel a lot of kind of unsatisfaction or dissatisfaction, excuse me, a general level of unhappiness or boredom or restlessness, kind of like INFJs. ENFJs are just a little bit better at getting out of that rut because they're a little bit more wired for extroversion as opposed to INFJs who can get stuck on that a little bit longer. And then we have INFPs. Now, INFPs are kind of an interesting one. A lot of people think INFPs are the absolute most depressed personality type. They're always about their feelings. They're so sensitive. But I would say that INFPs can be kind of in the middle for lots of different reasons. INFPs, if they get into a hopeless despair rut, that's when they're going to go up on the top of the list of being more depressed. If they get stuck in an uncomfortable circumstance that they just kind of endure, if they're not making the choices they need to make to have a better life, and they get kind of hopeless about it and kind of depressed about the future. If they're kind of a hopeless romantic type, they might feel a little bit more depressed. But INFPs have some things going for them as well. They have introverted feeling as their first function, and INFPs who are, pure INFPs and not like an ENFP or something, do have optimistic FI and SI, which means they can be comfortable being alone. They can feel good about themselves when alone. They can feel happy a little bit more easily than some types that have lower introverted feeling. They can have, enjoy the simple things in life, enjoy the small things in life with that introverted sensing child function. So INFPs can gain some level of satisfaction and joy from life just by simply existing and being able to appreciate life. That being said, if they get stuck in a situation where they're loyal to the wrong person or they're really hopeless about the future, that depression is going to skyrocket. So I'd say right in the middle for them, and they can kind of fluctuate. ENFPs, it can be the same way. But one thing that ENFPs have to struggle with, which is slightly different than INFPs, is they have pessimistic introverted feeling and introverted sensing. And as we go through this list, you'll see how important those functions are to a general feeling of kind of dissatisfaction and sadness that kind of come along with the term definite or depression. But like I said, you can define it in ways where anyone can be anywhere. But for the ranking list, we got to define it some way where we can rank them. But yeah, ENFPs, they have introverted feeling parent, which is a more pessimistic function. Introverted feeling parent, that second slot, it actually has a lot of fluctuation between high highs and low lows. It's kind of, I think, where a lot of bipolar definitions get, at least in my personal experience. Introverted feeling in those half pessimistic, half optimistic slots can experience some of that mania and depression. Of course, I'm not talking about a biological definition or a biological diagnosis or anything, but they can experience some of those symptoms of having high feelings, very sensitive personality type, and those feelings can be very positive and it can feel great, and then they can go very negative. It can feel overwhelmingly negative. So a lot of high highs and low lows with regards to feeling. And they still have some of those alienation problems with being an intuitive, but they have some things going for them because they are extroverted. They are connection focused. They can find people, they can find connection, and they're going to have a easier time potentially than some of the other types. So I could arguably put them lower. It just depends. But they do have some issues sometimes with depression, feeling dissatisfied, feeling hopeless, feeling bad about themselves, that can kind of have those negative loops, just like INFJs. They're just slightly better at finding connection, slightly less pessimistic with those functions still. Now, INTJs, I would say, INTJs are an interesting one. Like INFJs, they can definitely get into independent, lonely ruts where they just kind of isolate and they're not always initiating new relationships because the burden of initiation is often on them. With introvert intuition, they have to be the one to make that spark, that decision, that motive to get out there. They're not necessarily going to have people initiating with them. They're going to have to do the work. That can cause them to isolate more than some of the other personality types. They also have the introverted sensing demon, which can cause a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of loneliness as well. But one thing keeping them down from that absolute S tier is they do have optimistic introverted feeling. They can feel good about themselves even if they're alone. They can feel like things are good and going their way. And so because of that, it can keep them out of a rut slightly. But that introverted sensing indulgence kind of desire, that desire to fill the hole of loneliness can definitely lead them to some pretty depressed loops as well. Then we have ENTJs. ENTJs are an interesting one because they do have that kind of inferior, quote unquote, introverted feeling where they don't necessarily want to look at their feelings too much because if they do, they're going to be negative. So they often avoid their feelings with work, with money, with credentials, with power, gaining things that are external to try and fuel the internal feelings because they can feel negative when looked at. But, it's a balance for ENTJs. They can feel good. They can, ENTJs, they're kind of made for the world we live in. They're made for a very capitalistic society. And because of that, it can help them at the very least do the things they want to do, and they're kind of supported very, very well by our society. So because of that, ENTJs have a leg up compared to some different personality types that aren't necessarily supported by our society and how it functions. So ENTJs have a leg up there in being wired to kind of deal with society, being very ambitious, working hard, being intellectually focused, money focused, wanting to climb corporate ladders. These things give them kind of a leg up because they're kind of wired for it. But because of their introverted feeling, being in a pessimistic slot, that low introverted sensing, they can have those swings of sadness and depression when they introspect. But ENTJs are often not introspecting. They're going out there, they're trying to conquer goals and distract themselves as much as possible to not introspect. So I think that kind of lands them in the middle. If they introspect and isolate, they're going to go higher up on this list. But in general, they're kind of focused away from that. And then we have INTPs, and for INTPs, it's different because INTPs are definitely introspecting a lot more. They have pessimistic, introverted feeling, very low feelings, which can definitely cause a sense of unhappiness. They can get stuck in their comfort zone with positive SI, which kind of has a different effect to INFJs, whereas INFJs are going to feel never satisfied. You could argue INTPs are going to feel too satisfied too easily just staying by themselves somewhere, and it might not motivate them to get out of their comfort zone as much, and they might get stuck just doing what's enjoyable and comfortable, and that can lead to a long-term depression if they're not out there socializing, pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. That's definitely going to lead to a depression. They're still introverted, intuitive, so it's always going to be difficult for them to fit into society and into social groups quite as easily. They're going to often resort to kind of abandoning those social realms and going isolating by themselves, excuse me. So because of that, they can end up being a little bit more depressed, and then with that introverted feeling in a very pessimistic slot, it's going to make them even more depressed. So I'm going to say that they can be up on the S tier of feeling unhappiness. We have ENTPs. ENTPs, honestly, I'm just going to kind of put them in the middle. I think that they can feel some anxieties and depression, but they have FI Trickster. They're often not even feeling that bad in terms of emotion. Emotionally, they can feel unsatisfied. They might not necessarily fight for themselves to feel good, because they're kind of the opposite of the pursuit of happiness. They often don't care about their own happiness, and they just ignore it, which could arguably make them more depressed, make them less depressed. It depends how it ends up working. I don't know. This one's kind of interesting. I could even put them in C tier. I think that ENTPs in general are going to not necessarily be too depressed with regards to feeling, but like I said, if they ignore their feelings, they can end up putting themselves in depressing situations, in situations which aren't good for them, where they end up just generally being unhappy or unsatisfied. So I'm going to leave them in the B tier. I think it fluctuates, as I love to say. Then we have ISFJs. ISFJs can have a difficult time too. They have FI Critic, which means high enough feelings that you're going to feel them, but pessimistic enough that you're going to feel bad all the time. And you're just going to be in a bad mood almost all the time. At the very least, INTPs are just going to ignore their feelings, but IFJs feel them like 3 times as much. So the feelings are just pessimistic. They're simply significantly more active than FI Demon. And because of that, I'm going to say that they're definitely the S tier in terms of just generally having a low mood. They're going to isolate more than some of the other types on this list. They're going to have those negative moods more than some of the other types on this list. And so they're going to be in that situation where they're isolated, alone, and feeling those negative feelings, feeling that low dopamine. And we have ESFJs. ESFJs, I would say, in general, I think it can go up and down for ESFJs. It depends on their state. I'd probably put them in a C tier, because they do have that pessimistic SI and FI, which if they do, as I've said a million times, kind of end up alone, isolate, overindulging, they can definitely get into a depressed state. But if they're social, they're not going to feel that. In general, ESFJs are kind of made for the world, just like ENTJs, but in a completely different way. They're extroverted sensors, so they have an easier time forming bonds. They are a feeling hero, so they have an easier time forming bonds. And because of that, they're much less likely to end up alone and isolated than most of the other types. And because of that, in general, they're going to feel less depressed. But they do have some of that potential with the pessimistic FI shadow. And having some of those pessimistic functions can make them a little more depressed. ISTJs, I would say, are kind of an interesting one. They're almost the opposite of ESFJs in that they are going to be isolated a lot, but they're just going to enjoy being isolated more than ESFJs. And I wouldn't say that they're necessarily going to feel too depressed. This is kind of an interesting one. I feel like it's if I put too many too high, I'm not going to have any on the lower tier, so I'm going to try and put them lower. Because I think that it could be true. ISTJs, they have optimistic FI and SI, so at the very least, they're going to feel good and they're going to feel comfortable much easier than some of the other types. They also have that TE focus, which is, as I said, a very good fit for the current world with the capitalism. And they have that high introverted sensing, which can kind of be comfortable in a normal environment, which is also good for our current society. So because of that, I'm going to say they're not necessarily going to be too depressed. And same with ESTJs, although ESTJs have those pessimistic FISI functions in their ego, which means they can fluctuate a little bit more, just like ENFPs. They can have those low lows and those high highs. They're going to often focus on doing what they need to do and being habitual and making money as kind of a comfort. But they can definitely feel depressed if they're alone for longer periods of time because of those pessimistic functions. We have ISFPs. ISFPs in general, I would say, can be pretty good. See, the thing is, I have a problem putting anyone in the D tier because the truth is pretty much everyone, all of the types, in my opinion, can be depressed, and they can get depressed and just as depressed as anyone else. It just depends on their circumstances. So really, a better video would be how can each personality type be depressed, but that isn't as interesting to talk about maybe. But ISFPs can be depressed and be in depressed states. They have FI Hero, which sure has some positive feelings. They're a sensor, so they're a little bit more attuned to the world we live in right now, although I think that's going to change over the next few hundred years with AI and robotics. It's going to shift to intuitives having an easier time than sensors, and that's a whole other video idea. So in general, ISFPs in this current world, in this current climate, they have the feeling focus, which helps, the sensing focus, which helps, the positive feelings, which helps, but they can also become kind of idle and potentially isolate from people, which can lead to a depression as well. Sometimes the problem with ISFPs is they're not depressed enough. They might be alone, kind of doing whatever they want, and they might feel pretty good about it, and they might not get that negative emotion to drive them out of it. So while they can look depressed, they sometimes need more negative internal feedback in order to self-criticize. So sometimes they can be a little too happy, a little bit too ignorance is bliss focused. And ESFPs, I would say, definitely not D tier, because ESFPs, once again, have that pessimistic FI parent. It can have the high highs, the low lows, the mood swings can make it pretty difficult, but they're still extroverted feelers. They're going to get out there. They're going to connect with people a little bit more. They're going to really have an easier time finding their groupings, their wolf packs, and some of the other types. So because of that, it's going to probably lead to less depression just in general because they're ignoring it. But if they sit with their feelings and thoughts too long, then they're going to shoot up and have a difficult time with those. So some of these types are only not depressed because they're so good at being able to distract themselves. And some types are worse at distracting themselves or worse at being able to find a meaningful job that actually rewards their brain because their brains might not be wired for it, like an INFJ, or connection because their minds might have a difficult time reaching out. Then we have ISTPs, and ISTPs are kind of an interesting one. I definitely think that they can struggle with depression, just like INFJs. The only things ISTPs have going in their favor as opposed to INFJs is, if they have that thinking focus, which is fitted a little bit more towards our world. They have that sensing focus, so they're able to connect with people easier. They have more people they're compatible with. They're a little bit more normal, and so they have that going for them. So I would say A tier, S tier, you could put them anywhere, but definitely a little bit more on the depressed side with that FI demon, with that SI critic. The demon critic loops. You're not enough, you're not good enough, dissatisfied, very bored, very melancholic. But ESTPs are a little bit different. ESTPs are able to connect with people more. I would say ESTPs can definitely go up or down. ESTPs, they can get into depressive ruts for sure with the pessimistic FI and SI, as I've been saying this whole video. Obviously, any pessimistic internal functions are kind of what I'm talking about when it comes to depression. If we're talking more anxiety, you could argue that's pessimistic extroverted functions because you're anxious about the external world. But when it comes to an internal negativity, it's all about those introverted functions. And ESTPs, they're kind of flat across the board with the mix, but their SI and FI being in pessimistic slots can lead to depression if they're ruminating in them and stuck in them and not able to do the things they want and not able to get out into the external world. But the more they engage with the physical world, the more they engage with their external environment, have meaningful relationships, exercise, do the things they want to do, and aren't limited by the world or their body, they're going to get less depressed. So it really depends on their circumstances for ESTPs. So yeah, for ESTPs, it really does depend on those specific circumstances, whether they get stuck in a rut or whether they're able to get out there and actually engage with their goals and the things they want. But just like all of the 16 personality types, it's extremely environment dependent, right? So for INFJs and INTPs and ISFJs, they need external relationships in order to connect because they're all FE users. They need those external relationships to feel anything positive. And if they're not having other people who feel positive around them, they're just going to feel negative. And so that's just kind of the way it works. And that's why they can feel very depressed. They need that external feeling in order to feel good about themselves. And that's going to lead to that. Some of these other types have problems with feeling good, feeling bad, having those fluctuations, and finding stability and satisfaction and reliability internally are the things that are going to drive a less depression. So it really depends on every personality type. Let me know in the comments down below if you want a video more on what makes each personality type depressed and why, because the truth is all of these types can be depressed depending on the circumstances, some might just have a bit more disposition to be there naturally, especially at a younger age, and they can get stuck in those ruts. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, subscribe now, join the OnType team today as we are growing. So thank you so much for getting to this point in the video, and I hope you all have a great day.